I'm going to talk about the question tonight, what is housing for, picking up on the main themes in my book, which was published just a few months ago in June, Big Capital, Who is London For? So inevitably I'm going to talk about London, but in the context of the wider British economy, the wider British property economy, and the wider global property economy. Just one point to make before I start. My book was published on June the 1st, and 2 weeks later, the Grenfell Tower fire happened, the most appalling disaster imaginable to put housing on the front pages. And I think that that disaster spoke to a great many themes in the book, and to many themes which I'm going to talk about tonight. While the Grenfell fire was the most awful, awful disaster, I think it has opened a space of opportunity as well, and I'll try and pick that up at the end of my comments. One of the key themes in the book is that life at the top of the pyramid is actually linked to life at the bottom, and I spend quite some time going around the alpha parts of London, which some of you might be familiar with, the sort of so-called golden postcodes, the prime property spots that David has mentioned. And this is in the context of London and other cities being more unequal than ever before. One of the key themes I emphasise, I take directly from Thomas Piketty's landmark book, Capital in the 21st Century, and of course the title of the book is a self-conscious reference to that. And he repeatedly emphasises that in today's economy, the income from property, or the income from rent, if you prefer, is greater than the income from economic growth and wages. And this is one of the main factors fueling our contemporary casino-style speculative property economy, and this flood of capital and foreign investment which is coming into cities like ours, and which is linked to the displacement of communities and the destruction of public housing. So that's the overarching theme. Life at the top is linked to life at the bottom. I'm going to talk to you about both life at the top and life at the bottom. This is the sentence with which I start off the book. And actually, this is a friend of mine, Jan, who similar age to me. She's got a good job. She earns £40,000. Her partner has a job. They have 2 children. And this is what she has to put up with. This is what she posted on Facebook. And when I saw this post come up, she's one of my Facebook friends, I thought, I've got to put this in the book. And I just started the book with it. So, I mean, you know, this wasn't really research. This is part of my life. It's, I'm sure, part of a lot of your lives as well. So she wrote, surrounded by boxes yet again, about to move, knowing that we will be moving again in the new year. I have cleaned and painted the flat, and it's still a dump, with damp patches and a moth-eaten carpet throughout. I am 46 and I have lived in over 30 houses, and I still have no security. Okay, let's move to the other side of the coin. You will be familiar with these sorts of images, sometimes quite hard to tell if these are CGI images or if they are actually real images. The two seem utterly interchangeable. I have a feeling this is a CGI, can't be sure. This, however, is real. This is now Elephant Park, and this is one of the developer Lend-Lease's hoardings around Elephant Park. And I want to focus a little bit on this development in tonight's presentation. This, again, is a CGI. This is Elephant Park once more, but this is what Elephant Park is going to be once what is going to be apparently the largest new public park in Britain since Victorian times is created. But of course, this isn't a public park. It's going to be an entirely private park. which is not in the nature of parks as we generally tend to know them. And this is the Battersea Power Station redevelopment. Norman Foster, Frank Gehry's architecture on all sides, which, as the architecture critic Rowan Moore said, a great quote I thought, they have managed the seemingly impossible, which is to make Battersea Power Station look small. So this is a flavour of some of the architecture which is going up all across London. 300 towers of residential development, cranes and development, absolutely everywhere. And for everybody who says the answer to the housing crisis is that we need to build more homes, well, clearly not. We're building lots of homes. We're just not really building homes that people can afford to live in. And it's also relevant to note that the entire first phase of homes in Elephant Park has been sold 100% to foreign investors. And this is one of my absolute favourite images. Again, CGI, not yet built. This is the Sky Pool, which will be linking two 10-storey towers at the Vauxhall Nine Elms development just near the new American Embassy. And these are the sort of iceberg basements which characterise the alpha parts of London, costing $3 million or so apiece. And beneath the surface, I mean, this is obviously a particularly big one, but, you know, couldn't resist putting this in. And, you know, archaeologists of contemporary London will study this and find these catacombs reflecting how we lived. And these alpha parts of London actually are home to the most billionaires in the world. We've outstripped New York now as being billionaire favourite spot, also favourite spot of ultra-high net worth individuals. And as David has already alluded to, a lot of this money is corrupt money that was exposed by the Panama Papers, and I mean, you know, very large amounts of investment in anonymous shell companies. I think 40% of all this investment is in anonymous shell companies, and a lot of these properties aren't even occupied. They're so-called safe deposit boxes in the sky, the phenomenon of lights out London, similar sort of phenomenon in Manhattan and other North American cities. So then you get this argument, well, you know, isn't it a good thing for the city to attract lots of wealth and investment? This is the idea of trickle down. That wealth and investment will trickle down to the poorest parts of the city, which need it the most. It will generate lots of employment opportunities in all sorts of service industries. Well, you know, I think it is clearly proven over the last 30 years that trickle down has absolutely failed to work in the UK, and just very visibly all over this city, it is clear that wealth does trickle down, but it doesn't benefit the poorest communities, it simply displaces them. In fact, it actually displaces everybody, because if you look at what has happened in somewhere like Kensington and Chelsea, the old English elites cannot afford to live there either. So they sell up, they might move to the country, they'll buy their children homes in London, but they can't afford to buy their children homes in Kensington and Chelsea, so they'll buy them in previously unfashionable parts of the city like Acton or Peckham or Forest Gate, which are now starting to rapidly gentrify. In turn, property prices and rents go up in those areas, pushing those communities out. And so you have this process of displacement out of London to other cities, Bristol, Hastings, Margate. Those pressures then come into those areas, and so you see this trickle-down process in fact affecting the whole of the country. So you also get this other line of argument, which is that, well, you know, this is gentrification. You know, I make a very, very big point in the book that this is not gentrification. I think David referred to hyper-commodification. The original definition of gentrification, coined by Ruth Glass in the mid-60s, was of a much slower process, which might take place perhaps over a generation. What we're seeing now has nothing to do with that sort of definition where people would move into the inner city, do up a former working person's cottage, and sort of then gentrify the area gradually. That was a contested process. But what we're seeing now has got nothing to do with that. With the speed of capital flows that have come into London and other cities since the financial crash, this is on a completely different level. And it's as a result of quantitative easing, all the money which has come in to save the banking system post-financial crisis, which has disproportionately gone into the top end and into London property, combined with all of this corrupt money. Policies of state-led gentrification, as they can be described, which I will talk about in a minute. And then from the bottom, you have other pressures, the destruction of social housing, austerity policies, and the capping of housing benefit, which are making London an impossible place to live for anyone on low, middle, or even relatively high incomes, as we saw with my example of Jan, the woman I know, who earns 40,000. So to talk about these policies of state-led gentrification, as this has been described by some academics. So remember Elephant Park, which we looked at right at the beginning of the presentation. Well, this was Elephant Park. This was the Haygate estate in the middle of Elephant and Castle, home to 3,000 people on predominantly low incomes, although a good 25% or so of them actually owned their own homes, the right to buy owners that Mrs. Thatcher enfranchised with her famous flagship policy. And in 2014, Elephant Park was, very difficult to be clear about these terms. The Haygate estate was demolished, and now you've seen Elephant Park is in the process, almost finished, as nearly finished its construction process. And in fact, this is a process which is going on all across London. 100 estates or so have been demolished. Advocates call this process estate regeneration. Their critics call it social cleansing. This is Robin Hood Gardens, a very contentious estate because this is acclaimed by many as a modernist masterpiece. The bulldozers have already moved in here. This has been another very contentious site. This is Cressingham Gardens in Brixton, just overlooking Brockwell Park. The rhetoric surrounding these estates is often that these are sink estates which blight the lives of their residents, and it would be better for all if they were demolished. Well, there is no way on earth that anyone could call this a sink estate. It's a lovely place which was designed to meld with the park, and the community are now on their third judicial review. So it's an ongoing legal process to try to fight what the Labour Lambeth Council are pursuing there. So, why is this happening? Why at a time of acute housing crisis are we demolishing what remains of our genuinely affordable housing? Well, as I said, it's this sort of sink estate story behind it, that these are terrible places and actually we need lots of housing. So the only way we can build housing is to use all the land value that we will get from selling homes on these estates, and therefore we can subsidise the building of some affordable housing. As you can see, I don't really buy into this argument, particularly as the definition of affordable housing has been changed to now mean up to 80% of market rent or market value, which makes anything that's built in these developments completely unaffordable to all of us. And as David mentioned earlier, it's the rent gap. It comes back to this idea of the rent gap, which is the difference between the value of land and the potential value of the land. And when that difference becomes too large, then basically capital piles in, and this tends to be the result. And this was explained very well, I think, in this quote by Lord Adonis, who is the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission. And he spoke of how the scale of council-owned land is vast and greatly underappreciated. There are particularly large concentrations of council-owned land in inner London, and this is some of the highest priced land in the world. The local authority planning regime has got to adapt properly to the potential for market-priced developments. So, you know, this land value has got to be realised. Policymakers feel this is the only way that we can build housing, and hence we're seeing this huge churn. And actually, Adonis has also said he would be keen to see all of London's 3,500 estates undergo this process. Wow. I mean, you know, that is a huge change in demographic. And, you know, these are the results. This is Elephant Park. Again, CGI, I think, but it is nearly built. And the prices on Zoopla, 750,000 to $1 million for a two-bed flat. 25% affordable housing, but hey, 80% of $1 million, not really that affordable. And what happened to the tenants? Well, this is where the tenants on the Haygate have moved to, generally out of the immediate area. Communities disrupted, networks broken, kids have to leave their schools with all the attendant difficulties, social and mental health difficulties that poses. And ironically, it's the owners, the homeowners on these estates, the people who bought their homes under the right to buy, who've suffered the most, because they get such low values in compulsory purchase from local authorities that actually they cannot afford to stay in London on the whole. The average price for compulsory purchase on the Haygate was £100,000. Just compare that to the prices you're seeing now. And so these people have to leave London. And I've got some really heartbreaking stories of people I met and interviewed who now live outside of London and, you know, have not recovered from it. At the same time as these processes have been going on, to add another enormous part of the jigsaw, which I don't have time to go into in too much detail, but what we've seen over the last 30 years, I would say sort of amounts to the slow death of social housing and a shift, a very fundamental shift in policy, which came in with the right to buy, which saw more than 2 million council homes being sold off. And instead of building council homes, we decided to subsidise demand through housing benefit. And I call this from bricks to benefit as a way of trying to make it sort of comprehensive to people, because, you know, I feel when we talk about supply side and demand side policies, actually a lot of people get lost. So we stopped building and we started looking at housing benefit. And ultimately, you know, we've now reached this stage where since 2010, I don't believe that the government has really believed in social housing. I've shared platforms and I have spoken to people in government who have said, you know, they don't believe in social housing. We've also seen the rise of the private rented sector and buy-to-let. And now we've got a situation where 40% of council housing is owned by private landlords who rent out those properties at 3 to 4 times the price. And a third of social housing is actually now in the private rented sector, which leads to a housing benefit bill of 9.3 billion. And actually, that housing benefit bill doesn't even cover the rents, because now they've been capped. Tenants keep getting evicted because they can't afford to pay the rents. David also already mentioned a slide about rent to rent. Every aspect of your home is now marketised, and the conditions in the private renters sector, where there is famously no regulation. The head of Generation Rent said there are more regulations to run a cattery than a home, has led to some really terrible conditions like this. And these are the illegal beds in sheds. There are thousands and thousands of these in back gardens in sort of outer London suburbs. And I briefly described earlier to you this new London that has emerged alongside this. So this is my final slide, back to the question that we're thinking about today. What is housing for? Well, you know, David's already talked about housing being a human right and a public good. And I think a lot of us do still subscribe to that rather than a financialised commodity. I try to look at this in the final chapter of the book through the lens of the concept of the right to the city, Henri Lefebvre's famous idea, which is also enshrined in UN Habitat 3, and that's the idea of the city as a contested space rather than a financialised, market-led monoculture. Some things that we can do. We really need to address this casino economy and the monopoly of the big house builders. Land value tax is something that a lot of other countries look at very successfully. In Zurich, publicly owned land, apparently now publicly owned land has to be used for cooperative housing. This is the sort of policy that would bear dividends. I think Alex actually mentioned this to me when I saw him last. You know, it's a sort of thing that we do not consider. But as I said at the beginning, it's very much about democratic representation and real participatory democracy. And in place of not listening to communities, completely ignoring communities, having this nexus of councils and lobbyists and developers making all the decisions, we have got to re-involve people in what happens to their local communities. And we have to reimagine housing, not as a problematic tenure for those on lowest incomes, but actually as a mixed community where all of us might live as it was originally envisaged. So thank you.